Andrew, good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
So this week we're going to be wrapping up the Casey Anthony case, and there's a few things we are going to go over today. First, we're going to review the evidence, and the evidence is an interesting piece in this case because most of it is circumstantial, and of that circumstantial evidence, it only really gives us a direction of what's going on. It doesn't prove anything. I wanted to start off with one thing that it's something that's been playing on my mind for the last few weeks as I've been looking at this case, and it's that whole matter of sexual assault that came to light in the trial. Now, originally, I think I was quite happy to determine that Casey Anthony was guilty based on her behavior leading up to her arrest in the trial. I felt like that was incriminating. And we're going to talk about it in a bit. Even the coroner declared it an unproven homicide, given the nature of the way the body was found and also the active cover-up of Kaylee missing. And that was pretty much an indicative piece for me. But it made me really question the whole, how seriously should we be taking Casey Anthony's claims of being sexually abused by her father? I think for me, it's something where, this day and age, when we talk about Me Too, there's a lot of positive movements that have been made that have empowered a lot of women to come out against their, I don't know what the word is, their aggressor, the person who sexually assaulted them. And Casey Anthony has a credibility issue. But one of the things that I had come up against time and time again when reading about Casey Anthony and reading about the behavior of people who have been sexually abused as children, a lot of the behaviors that she, I guess, exhibited are actually fairly indicative of somebody who's been abused as a child. Do you find any of these claims feasible in any way? What is your view? Because I haven't really heard what you thought on that. We haven't talked about it too much.
Well, I think you have two separate questions that you're sort of outlining there. One of which is, in general, are the kinds of behaviors exhibited by Casey Anthony a sort of seeming dissociation from what had happened to her daughter?
Yeah.
A lack of what you might consider to be appropriate emotional response. A distance, a kind of sense that like there's a wall between her and reality. These are all things that I think are consistent with people who've experienced trauma of one kind or another. And obviously childhood sexual abuse qualifies as perhaps the most, outside of like actual death, the most chilling of all possible traumas. And so in a sense, if you examine her behavior, and you couldn't rule out the possibility that she is the victim of some kind of trauma. So in that sense, there's a credibility there, if that makes sense. Like that the behavior is indicative of a pattern that could conceivably stem from a childhood trauma or a sexual abuse situation. The problem is, as I think many people have noted, first of all, these are responses to trauma. The trauma need not be a childhood sexual abuse. It could be anything.
Yeah.
It could be that her parents hit her. Not that that's great, but that's a little bit different than being sexually abused. Maybe they just were, severe physical disciplinarians. Not that that's good, but it's probably a step below what you'd consider to be actual outright sexual abuse. Maybe the trauma is not that at all. Maybe it's something that she experienced as a child. Maybe she was sexually abused. Of course, she doesn't claim this, but maybe she was sexually abused by somebody else, or maybe it's something else entirely, or any one of a number of things could lead to the behaviors you're seeing. So then the question becomes, Casey Anthony, who is a proven and consistent liar, is the source of her behavior what she says it is, which it's not unreasonable. Like if she says it and you believe it, then the behavior that you see is consistent with it. On the other hand, we only have her word for it, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because she has not been shown to be somebody whose word is worth very much.
And she had two psych surveys or psych analyses that were done. One of which was done by a standard called MMPI, which is apparently quite a high standard for assessing someone's mental state. They were trying to determine whether she was of sound mind to, go on trial, and they determined she was. Now, I think the thing that I wanted to connect to this is, let's say she and I'm not saying that I think she has or hasn't. This isn't me giving an opinion. It's a hypothetical. So if Casey Anthony was a victim of abuse, should this have impacted the verdict in any way? Because it was a big linchpin to the case, to the defense. It was one of the big pieces they came out with. And it was more of an explanation of why she behaved the way she did, the 30 days after Kaylee was missing. Do you think that would have any impact on the verdict, or should have any impact on the verdict?
I mean, I think it did have impact on the verdict, because I think in a situation like this, I mean, I think the real truth is that, kind of like the Darlie Routier case, you're dealing with something that's so horrific, if the prosecution's theory is correct, that a mother has, it's not just Casey Anthony, right, for an individual juror. It's the pattern of human psychology. Mother is a function, it's a role, and it's a sacred one in the human mind across all cultures and all times, right? Mother is this critical, and it's not just human beings, right? I mean, you could start going into the animal kingdom. The father role is, is not as universal as the mother role, because you see the father role exists in some animal, species and others, mammalian species, and in others it does not. Probably in the majority it does not. But the mother role is always there. And so when people are trying to wrap their minds around someone becoming so, again, it's just speaking to something that's psychologically elemental. Yeah. And people have a hard time wrapping their brain around it. So they want an explanation, right? They always say that motive is not an element of the crime that the prosecution must prove, right? But it is one that any prosecutor will tell you, if you want a conviction, you'd better have a good one. You'd better be able to tell the jury a story. And because if not, they're going to fill in their own. Yeah. And I think here, Casey Anthony, through her defense attorney and through that opening statement, provided a kind of potential answer to how could this have happened? How could someone, a young, and you add the fact that she is young, she's attractive, she presents as someone that people want to like, just on a purely visual, visceral, first impact level.
Yeah.
How could this young, pretty, seemingly nice person who came from a nice neighborhood turn into this callous monster and reject the role of mother? People want an explanation. And so I do think it impacted the verdict. Should it have? I mean, the defense is entitled to present any defense that they can. I guess there could be a question as to what degree the judge should have allowed this to be spoken of when it was not corroborated in any particular way. It was not testified to. It was simply an argument made by the defense in their opening statement. And I honestly, and this is where my limitation starts to come in, is that I'm not an attorney and I've never run a trial, so I don't know what the rules are about how far you can push. I mean, I know that there's an objection out there that one can make as an attorney. It's called objecting to objection, no foundation objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. And I think in both cases, you could make a case that this assertion both lacks foundation and assumes facts not in evidence.
I think when I was looking at this, and that's it's an interesting point of view, because there's two ways that people can take this. One of which is it's foundational to the case, and it really highlights motivation with Casey Anthony. And this, I think the initial point of that was to say, look, her missing her daughter for 30 days is not indicative of somebody who's murdered and covering up something. It's indicative of somebody who's reacting as they've always reacted based on trauma. Now, I've gone two ways with this, or it was three ways really. Initially, guilt because of behavior. And then I got to say that the defense, when I started looking into it, was somewhat compelling because it started to get me to change my view when I started to research what is symptomatic of somebody who's been abused. But it's actually taken me back the other way, because when I was looking into this, there were certain names that came up in my research. Have you heard of Susan Smith before?
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah.
the thing
She
that
blamed the imaginary black man.
yes, yeah, which is always suspicious. As soon as somebody says some black guy, whenever they're talking about somebody who murdered somebody as a scapegoat, I'm automatically suspicious. But when we take a look at this, Susan Smith, she made up a story. She killed her children. It wasn't something that was, it was a shock story. There's a lot of the same patterns. She was somebody who was abused as a child. And, a lot of her behaviors can be explained by somebody maybe who had trauma early in life. Most people who commit crimes to that degree have some sort of baggage that they're bringing with them. And if anything, it actually changed my view that, maybe Casey could be very, very guilty of doing something quite nefarious, even though she comes across as someone who is sweet, who is an affable person who would never do that. And it actually took me back the other way, because if she clearly isn't wired correctly, or that's not the right way to say, but she has a screw loose to a degree. I think that's the clinical appropriate psychological term, screw loose. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Right. I think that's right in the DSM-5 now these days.
But it's for me, it gives some sort of justification that maybe I need to be looking at her a bit more harshly. Now, when I say harshly, I don't mean not being sympathetic of what might have been something difficult that happened to her. I'm willing to, as I am with anybody, give them their day to make their claim that something happened to them by an aggressor, by somebody. But on the other side of the coin, it also opens up the possibility that she has some damage that may cause her to do something quite nefarious. So it's changed my view a bit on that, which I didn't expect to go down that road.
Well, and I mean, this is the problem, right? And there's a lot of this case that can cut both ways. It's easy to see Casey as callous and indifferent. I mean, a lot of her behavior would suggest that. She obviously, she ended up having to admit, right, that the nanny story was a complete fabrication.
Yeah.
She was doing things, like participating in the hot body contest.
Yeah, she was.
And hanging out with the boyfriend and watching movies from Blockbuster, right? They went to Blockbuster.
They hammered Blockbuster.
Right. And let's not forget stealing checks from friends and writing checks for things that, you know, she couldn't actually afford. All of this is, it sounds like somebody who is both obviously not traumatized and not seemingly even interested in what has happened to her daughter. And also like somebody who, it's a flurry of activity, a flurry of, Casey, I think it's interesting. We've discussed, I think, in one of our previous versions, but if not, I know you and I have discussed it offline. The fact that Casey was, until everything seemed to unravel for her at the end of high school, she was an A and B student, right?
Yeah.
And she seemed to, she would have fit the bill of somebody who, like this is somebody who's, if not exactly going places, certainly is on track to be successful in life, right?
Yeah.
And then obviously she does get pregnant, has the child, but that doesn't seem to disrupt her academics until she just fails to make the one credit. And it does seem like something changes, right, in the last year of, Kaylee's life, let's say, where all of a sudden, she fails to graduate high school over one credit. Then this thing happens with Kaylee, and she starts engaging in a variety of, she lost her jobs at Universal somewhere along the line, but pretended to go to it. That all sounds to me like somebody who is arguably, one thing about like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, they can be late onset, meaning, that I don't know how late it is. 'Cause, Casey was how old was she when this this went down.
She must have been 23 or 24, something like
23. Yeah.
that.
So I guess the high school thing happened sort of. So it's a longer period than I'm imagining, but it does seem like that there's like a downhill roller coaster that gets started that wasn't necessarily always present. And you could argue that all these things add up to sort of an emerging mental illness, and that especially the flurry of activity around Kaylee's disappearance kind of has like some of the hallmarks of like sort of a manic episode, even, like the stealing, participating in a hot body, kind of like doing all this stuff all of a sudden. But again, I don't know that any of that, I mean, like, it's all interesting. It's all grist for the mill, but I guess at the end of the day, the question is, does it, it doesn't necessarily speak to the factual case, A, and B, even if it did, does it excuse, even accepting that it doesn't, does any of it provide what you could reasonably call an excuse? And
that's what I guess that's what makes this case so interesting, is everything in this case is an outlier. There's nothing that's even psychologists or forensic psychologists, when you read articles about their view on Casey's behavior, because they haven't done a full case history, there's no consistency or no consensus on whether her behavior is consistent or not consistent with, let's say, abuse.
Yeah.
But let's dig into maybe some of the evidence. And the first one I thought that was fairly compelling were the internet searches for foolproof suffocation on the day. And there's also previous searches for chloroform. I think these are obviously they obviously paint a picture. And I think they're really important details that help build sort of a narrative of what actually happened. Now, just to fill everybody in, the chloroform search, Cindy Anthony took responsibility for, saying she was trying to find out what her dog was eating and was searching chlorophyll and then came across chloroform. And foolproof suffocation, this is a bit contended. So the defense said that was George Anthony, who had shown suicidal tendencies, looking for a way out because his daughter or his granddaughter had died that day, or maybe just before then. And Marcia Clark, who was the on the OJ defense team, she did a show and she did her own investigation, and her team found that the internet search actually happened after George can be proven to be at work by Casey. And the foolproof suffocation also, she said, was the search history was deleted the moment Casey gets dropped off from her first police interview, and she was the only one home. I find the chloroform, I don't think that's anything. I don't think that's anything at all, personally. I
wouldn't go that far.
Well, the question is, what can you do with, how do you get chloroform if you're Casey Anthony? So we've established.
Well, I would ask the question differently, which is, can you name me another legitimate purpose for chloroform?
Well, there was enough doubt put in by the defense that you can get those chemical responses from household cleaners, and Cindy Anthony cleaned the shit out of that car when she smelled whatever was in there.
Okay.
So I'm willing to discount that, but I read that if, let's say, Casey was searching how to make chloroform, there's a distillation process that goes into actually getting chloroform in a usable function. Now, we've established Casey Anthony is not digging up bamboo weeds with a shovel. She sure as shit is not distilling chloroform in her basement like she's on
Maybe that's why
Bad.
She then searched for foolproof suffocation, because she looked up chloroform and was like, oh, that sounds too hard. Let me try something else.
So, and that does make the searches compelling. And I think that, for me, is something I want to put a pin in, because I'm going to come back to that when I give my theory as to what happens. Anything else on foolproof suffocation?
Well, I mean, it's hard to think up it, unless Casey Anthony were planning on becoming a writer of mystery novels. And I'm a little surprised she didn't trot that excuse out, frankly. Yeah. It's hard to think of good reasons why one would be Google searching for that term. Let me put it this way. If no one had been suffocated, I guess you could easily think of, like, why would someone look that up? Maybe they're just morbidly curious. But, it's certainly an eyebrow-raising coincidence that, the little girl managed to die shortly after or
Yeah.
around the same time as that term was searched for.
And I would also argue that if, let's say, the defense's case, let's say that it's arguable whether it was George or Casey. I can't see if Kaylee had gone missing that day, and that was the day that Casey said that Kaylee drowned. I can't see somebody who is that traumatized sitting down at their computer, logging in, and starting to Google ways to commit suicide on the same day. Granted, crazier things have happened, but it just seems like a bit of a stretch that all of that would have been happening the same day. He had, if George is guilty of covering up the body, he's got a full workload that day. He's got to tape things.
Wasn't he? He's an ex-cop, right?
Why would he need to do that as well? You think
somebody
who is
he could go get a gun without So, has anyone ever suffocated themselves to death as suicide? I mean, I guess it's happened. People put a bag over their head and tie it off with a string. It seems like highly unusual.
With some sort of catalyst in the bag. Not to be so morbid about it, but it was. I think the search was saying you can, do this painfully with some sort of a inhalant in the bag and suffocate yourself. And that was the search parameter, which would lean me more away from George and more towards somebody who, like Casey.
Yeah.
Next one. So this one I'm adding into there. I think I forgot I slipped this one in because I find this to be a compelling one because, again, it goes back to my favorite Columbo saying, I want to know the things that are different. I'm interested in when behaviors change. And the neighbor can't, he in his testimony on the stand, the defense did a good job of saying, hey, do you always watch Casey? Are you watching her all the time? Do you know what her behaviors are like coming and going to the house? And he said no. However, it was notable to the point, a few things. One, she borrowed a shovel right around the day that Kaylee would have disappeared. And we can, again, we discussed this before. She may have borrowed the shovel and thought, nah, it's too much work. I'm not going to do that. But the other thing is he noticed she had been coming and going for the better part of 3 or 4 days and thought she was moving. That is really notable to me, a change in behavior right around that point. If the defense is trying to make a case that George was taking care of everything, why is she coming and going like she's moving house?
Yeah, I think that this is, again, a difficult thing. I mean, it's this is the definition of circumstantial evidence, right? In that by itself, maybe it doesn't mean anything. But in combination with other factors, it certainly starts to paint a picture. And yeah, I mean, again, I think you're right. Like it's the kind of thing that's easy for a neighbor. Like I think about my own neighbors. Like, do I notice them? I mean, I see them outside the house doing things. Would it be easy for me to distinguish one from the other? Not really, unless I saw them starting to pack suitcases or something. That would stand out a little bit. Yeah,
you do notice things that are not. You're programmed to notice differences and things that are out of the ordinary. And we're not going over this, so I'm not going over this because this is proof. I think what I want to do is I want us to go through this. For me, these are things that are notable to help us build a theory of what happened.
I see.
None of it was proven. There's no evidence out there that really confirms what's happened. And that's going to be something we're going to come back to when we start talking about, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Sure.
The next one is the duct tape. The duct tape for me is, it's a troubling piece of evidence because if you're using duct tape, so Kaylee was found with duct tape around her skull, around the nose and mandible, and on her hair when they found the remains. And when you're starting to say, okay, well, my daughter drowned and somebody hid the body, the duct tape is, why would you do that? Why would you cover the face and mouth and head and wrap it in duct tape? And for me, that's more of a nefarious element. And that creates a lot of doubt as to the whole drowning story, which is what Casey is admitting happened.
Yeah, I mean, the duct tape is really, it's certainly, and again, and I know we're going to talk about this more. Casey Anthony is free for one reason, and that is because the coroner could not establish the specific cause of death.
Yeah.
And the coroner, in interviews I've seen with her, does say that she, she feels regret about, I guess, either the way she maybe regret's not the right word, but she feels as though people did not take her testimony the way she intended it. That when you're establishing cause of death, some of it is, can you examine the physical remains and establish through physical examination, what actually caused, in a specific scientific, physiological way, the death of an individual. But you're also taking into account the circumstances that, if you find somebody in their home, for example, and they've been dead for maybe they're an older person who doesn't have any relatives in the area and no one noticed, maybe they live in a slightly isolated area, and by the time someone finds their body, it's so decomposed you can't establish a specific cause of death, but you could say, oh, but there was no signs of a break-in, nothing was disturbed, the person has a history of hypertension. There was, they were older, they were in their mid 70s, and they were found, in their bed, under the covers, like they had gone to sleep and simply hadn't woken up. You can infer from all of that there's no sign of foul play, there's no reason to suspect foul play. And so even though you can't name the specific cause, was it a heart attack, was it a stroke, was it something else, you can say that these were these appear to be natural causes. Conversely, what her argument is that, yes, I can't tell you exactly what killed Casey, but her body was found in a place where it was concealed. There was an attempt to conceal it. It was not specifically buried, but it was placed someplace it should not have been, and obviously was handled in a way, that seems to be trying not just to conceal the body, but also the cause of death, trying to basically allow somebody to escape any kind of responsibility. And that those circumstances should, or were what led to her classifying the death as a homicide, even though she couldn't say how Kaylee had died. And the duct tape is obviously the central piece of that. And it's hard. I mean, the only thing that you could, if you're trying to explain it, and you'd have to sit here and make yourself do it, is that, okay, Kaylee drowned in the pool for some reason. Either Casey or her father or both panicked, and they decided to dispose of Kaylee's body because they were afraid that if they admitted to the authorities what had actually happened, that one or both of them would go to jail for neglect. And so they, in wrapping up her body to prepare it for whatever disposal they were going to do, they found it necessary for some reason to wrap her head in duct tape to keep, because obviously a person's mouth will naturally just hang open once they're passed away unless you secure it in some fashion. So that is why her head was wrapped in duct tape as a way of preventing her mouth from hanging open. But this is why? I mean, you then tossed her, not buried, not in any kind of respectful way. She was literally thrown in the laziest way possible, really, a few blocks from the home, in a way that sort of was an attempt to conceal it, but also kind of feels like unwilling even to put in the necessary effort to do that properly. So it makes it all, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, the duct tape is really problematic.
I looked at the duct tape. When I heard Jeff Ashton, the prosecutor, he said the only explanation for the tape being over the face was suffocation. Now that's an arguable point, and I don't think you can delineate that from, the evidence. But my first thought was, well, this is somebody trying to cover a face, and this is the first resource that let's say Casey or whomever found. Mm-hmm. However, the problem I have with that, if it was used as a means of covering up, one, a bag is easier, and two, if you're covering a face, which is generally a guilty thing, somebody who murders a loved one, many times they cover the head or the face because they don't want to be, they don't want them to look at the face. There's a lot of guilt involved. But the fact that the eyes weren't covered tells me that it wasn't there just to cover or protect. It was, maybe there was some nefarious reason as to, why the duct tape was only over the mouth and the nose. And it makes me think twice, because you're going to cover the eyes as well if you're using it to cover the full face and head. But it for me, it pretty much discounts the whole swimming pool
I mean, even if I'm stretching, Sean, even if I'm stretching and thinking like, how else? Maybe it was never used intentionally on her head. Maybe they put her in a bag and then they were going to seal up the bag with duct tape, but did a half-ass job of that somehow, so that the tape somehow eventually worked its way off the bag and on. But I mean, I'm really having to like invent scenarios here. And this is where you start to get to like, and we'll talk about it later, what defines reasonable doubt. Because if I'm having to do this kind of mental gymnastics to explain why that duct tape is there, it certainly causes a problem. Having said that, the duct tape, as much what it does is it perhaps establishes that Kaylee came to an unnatural end. It doesn't really do anything to establish by whose hand, or
even
under
how,
what.
Really.
For
me, it's a piece of evidence that talks to intent, right. Accident versus purposeful action. And next one, this was a big talking point for the defense, and they felt that this was evidence that George Anthony had involvement. The fact that he attempted to commit suicide. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story. George Anthony went to a hotel room. He texted everybody to said, "I'm on my way out." He took a shit ton of pills and drank a bunch of alcohol. And apparently he wasn't far off from going wrong. They caught him in time. But he wrote a suicide letter, and it was a really interesting suicide letter in the sense that he was writing until he couldn't write anymore. And it was just like, "Oh, I'm getting tired. I'm coming to see you, Kaylee." And it was very much just a rolling narrative of somebody who had taken quite a few pills. And in it, the defense said that this is proof that he was guilty. Now, I've grabbed a section of this, and okay, so I'm going to be putting my biases in here a little bit, but I'm going to grab a section of this that I find to be the most compelling, and I'm going to read it, because for me, this indicates he had nothing to do with this. So this is somebody who's writing a suicide letter, loves his daughter. If there were ever an opportunity to take the blame off of his daughter, get her out of prison, he can accept responsibility, said he did it, he did X, Y, and Z. But what he writes is, "I blame myself for her being gone." And that's what the defense is triggering on. For months, as a matter of fact, for a year or so, I brought stuff up, only to be told not to be negative. I sit here falling apart because I should have done more. She was close to home. Why was she there? Who placed her there? Why is she gone? Why? For months, you and I, especially you, always questioned why. I want this to go away for Casey. What happened? Why could she not come to us? Especially you. Why not Lee? Who is involved with this stuff for Kaylee? I'm going crazy because I want to go after these people Casey hung with prior to Kaylee being gone. To me, that almost tells me that he's dying, and he is not in any way giving any sense of guilt, or this shows somebody who's innocent and confused and just can't take it.
Yeah. I mean, assuming that he really believed himself to be dying, and it sounds like there's no reason to think that he wasn't in that state of mind or frame of mind. This doesn't read like a deathbed confession, so certainly. It's a little, at times, obscure, but I guess that's to be expected given how heavily intoxicated he was as he was writing this. Like,
yeah.
I mean, especially you, why not Lee? I'm not sure I follow who he's really talking to there. Who's the you? I want this to go away for Casey. Okay. Yeah, what happened? Why should she not come to us? I assume that the she there is Casey. Why should Casey not come to us for help? Yeah. Especially you. Why not Lee? I assume the Lee is short for Kaylee. But the you there, it's a little obscure. And it does seem like he believes on some level, if you take this at face value, that someone close to Casey but not Casey is somehow partially or perhaps finally responsible for the disappearance of Kaylee. But in any event, I don't think this note does for the defense what they hope it does.
No, it's really interesting. I didn't really pay attention to that. That's a really good catch. For me, it was the Why was she close to home? Why, which is what a police officer would ask. You know, why would Kaylee be in this place about 100 yards from our house for so long? Why would she be placed there? The questions we're asking. He's asking these questions, and the central, I guess, narrative of the defense is he took care of it. Kaylee drowned, and he took care of it for Casey. That to me just pretty much negates that whole narrative right there.